Hi, I'm Fionn. I'm an educational psychologist, and for my doctoral thesis, I looked at adolescent masculinity and homophobic aggression. And in this presentation, I'm going to talk about one of the two papers of my thesis. This was a paper exploring the link between adolescent masculinity and homophobic name-calling, and it was a systematic review and meta-analysis. With thanks, as always, to my supervisors, Sarah and Cora. So an overview of the background literature. Research has found an enduring link between masculinity and homophobia in both men and adolescent boys. Homophobic epithets and name-calling continue to be common parlance in some schools and friendship groups. This name-calling is often perceived as innocuous jokes or banter among friends, as opposed to homophobic bullying directed at sexually diverse individuals. Research suggests that homophobic name-calling in adolescent friendship groups is used to police masculinity rather than sexuality, and it's used to enforce conformity to traditional gender norms. In this paper, I talk about hegemonic masculinity, but what is this exactly? So hegemonic masculinity is the prevalent type of masculinity in society today. It's a social construct which shifts and changes with society, so its definition is fluid. However, in today's society, hegemonic masculinity is characterized by what are considered traditional masculine traits, such as anti-femininity, achievement, risk, lack of empathy, and avoidances of appearances of weakness or expressions of emotion. Hegemonic masculinity is also associated with socially destructive traits, such as misogynistic attitudes and homophobia. Men who adhere to this hegemonic masculinity also hold institutional power due to the patriarchal society in which we live. A patriarchal society is one in which men hold power and privilege over women and men who don't adhere to this exact type of masculinity. So in recent years, people have started to use the term toxic masculinity, and that's not a term I've used in this paper. However, interestingly, Hader in 2016 stated that masculinity under patriarchy turns toxic, which illustrates that it's not masculinity itself that is toxic, but it's the patriarchy that is problematic, as it legitimizes the subordination of other forms of masculinity, violence against women, and homophobia, to maintain the institutional power of men who adhere to this one specific form of masculinity. Hegemonic masculinity reinforces patriarchal norms, which disempowers women and femininity. Consequently, this invites men to distance themselves from femininity, and this anti-femininity is an essential component of hegemonic masculinity. But how does this relate to homophobia? Well, in hegemonically masculine men, sexuality and gender are often incorrectly conflated, and so they view homosexuality as inherently feminine. So homophobia, as a component of hegemonic masculinity, is perhaps more about gender, sexism, and misogyny rather than homophobia. Homophobia is also inherently linked to one's view of their own masculinity, and is driven not by a fear of gay men, but a fear of being perceived as insufficiently masculine by other men. So for hegemonically masculine men, to prove their own masculinity, they must distance themselves from things coded as feminine, and therefore by defaulted coded too as homosexual. Globally, men and boys hold more homophobic views than women and girls. Homophobia is a way of policing masculinity and enforcing conformity to hegemonic masculinity, and this can start as early as primary school. In adolescence, boys use homophobic name-calling to target other boys who transgress typical gender norms, for example, expressing behaviours or traits typically viewed as feminine. And this homophobic name-calling is often perceived as innocuous banter or a joke, and it's often directed at heterosexual targets. Interestingly, boys who use this language often do not perceive themselves to be homophobic. And this is because it's more about gender than it is about sexuality. So it's used to indicate to boys that they are expected to conform to hegemonic masculinity and display those traditionally masculine behaviours and traits. Homophobic name-calling is used within peer groups, particularly those who value hegemonic masculinity, and it's a way of asserting one's masculinity by denying it to others. And that's the quote by Pascoe in 2005. Although it may not always be used with the intention of being homophobic, it still is, and it creates a really hostile environment, particularly for sexually diverse young people. So that was the background literature, and that led me to these research questions. How does hegemonic masculinity lead to homophobic aggression in young people? Are adolescent hegemonic masculinity and homophobic name-calling statistically related concepts? And what other factors interact with the relationship between adolescent hegemonic masculinity and homophobic name-calling? I conducted a systematic search of 4 databases. Studies were included if the participants were school age, between 10 and 19 years old. I only included empirical studies which used empirical designs, and the study must have quantitatively measured both homophobic name-calling and masculinity. So in the end, 7 studies were included in the review, as you can see from my Prisma table here. Review is the first to quantitatively measure the relationship between masculinity and homophobic name-calling in adolescence using a meta-analysis and narrative synthesis. When I had all of my studies, I went through them and extracted the effect size for the relationship between the name-calling and masculinity, and these were the effect sizes included in the meta-analysis. 6 studies were included in the meta-analysis, as one study didn't include the necessary effect size, and attempts to contact the authors were unsuccessful. I used a random effects model to conduct the meta-analysis, and it revealed a statistically significant relationship between masculinity and homophobic name-calling in adolescence. And here is my forest plot that shows the effect sizes for all the included studies. I also included a narrative synthesis to look in more detail at the relationship between homophobic name-calling and masculinity. This slide shows a summary of those findings. I found that several factors interact within the relationship between homophobic name-calling and masculinity, including peer groups, bullying, and age. And overall findings of the narrative synthesis suggest that there's 2 functions of homophobic name-calling. The first being jokes or banter within peer groups, which is in line with the previous research, and the second being as a direct form of homophobic bullying. Importantly, both functions are rooted in the policing of, rooted in the policing of masculinity. One to enforce boys to conform to a hegemonic form of masculinity, and the other to ostracize those who do not fit this mold. So let's have a look a bit more closely at the findings from the studies included in this review and how they point to the 2 functions described here. The first function of homophobic name-calling being used within peer groups as banter. There are several findings within the studies in this review which support this idea, including that boys were more likely to engage in homophobic name-calling with a friend than someone they didn't know. They're more likely to use it against someone they did not think to be gay rather than someone they did. Participants tended to be friends with peers with similar levels of homophobic name-calling as their own. It was used more within male friendship groups rather than female, and peer groups high in masculinity had higher homophobic name-calling. And peer group levels of homophobic name-calling significantly predicted an individual's level 6 months later. Also, interestingly, peer groups high with homophobic name-calling victimization later went on to show high levels of perpetration, which researchers believed was related to the normalization of this language within the peer group. Again, this function is driven by a need to police masculinity. And then the second form is as a direct form of homophobic bullying. So although it may be used as a joke or banter within a peer group, often the boundaries of this joke can become blurred and escalate into aggression. And findings from the studies in this review showed significant correlations between homophobic name-calling and bullying. The studies found both within-person and between-person effects of bullying and homophobic name-calling, namely that when participants reported higher rates of bullying perpetration compared to their average, they also showed higher rates of homophobic name-calling at the same time point. Some measures of masculinity correlated with the use of homophobic name-calling targeted at a stranger, use of homophobic name-calling to ostracize people outside of the peer group or in-group, and they also showed use of homophobic name-calling to punish those who do not conform to hegemonic masculinity. So both functions are rooted in the desire to police masculinity, and regardless of the intention, both functions create a hostile environment and are therefore harmful to sexually diverse individuals. The studies in this review also found several risk factors which contributed to an increase in homophobic name-calling. These were impulsivity, violence, and sexual harassment. Interestingly, all of the identified risk factors also considered definitional features of hegemonic masculinity, particularly sexual harassment. So perhaps these aren't independent risk factors, but actually further evidence of the link between hegemonic masculinity and homophobic name-calling. Similarly, a protective factor against homophobic name-calling that was found by one study in this review was empathy. And this may also be related to hegemonic masculinity rather than a separate factor. Because a component of hegemonic masculinity is emotional restriction, and empathy is often considered a somewhat feminine trait. Therefore, perhaps a lack of empathy is also a component of hegemonic masculinity, as boys who adhere to this masculinity are motivated to avoid anything coded as feminine, including perhaps showing empathy. And this was the idea that actually led me to the empirical study of my thesis. Some strengths and limitations. One strength is the inclusion of a meta-analysis in the review, as it enables definite inferences from the data to be drawn, whereas systematic reviews without meta-analysis often reach uncertain conclusions. A benefit of a meta-analysis is that pooling several studies can increase the power to detect small effect sizes, and when pulled together, insignificant effect sizes from studies can contribute to an overall effect size, and due to the increased statistical power, a meta-analysis can detect effects that may be missed in individual studies or overlooked in systematic reviews. A significant limitation of this review is that most of the studies were conducted in the USA, so it's difficult to generalize these findings outside of the Western world. And much of psychology is conducted in weird cultures, weird standing for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And this review contributes to this shortcoming of the discipline. And this is more problematic due to the understanding that masculinity is a social construct and might vary between cultures. So some ideas for future research include looking further into the relationship between empathy, masculinity, and name-calling, and then looking at other protective factors as well. And future research could look at how we can use our better understanding of hegemonic masculinity and homophobic name-calling in order to create interventions in educational settings to reduce the negative impacts of hegemonic masculinity and hopefully in turn reduce homophobic name-calling. And research directly including the voices of young people will also be really important. Implications for school and educational psychology. This review highlights that homophobic language and aggression might still be a problem in some schools. And although boys may use this language as a joke, this can create a hostile environment for young people, particularly those who aren't disclosing their sexuality. Therefore, school bullying policies should specifically address homophobic name-calling and bullying, as settings with positive school climates and protective policies have been found to be a protective factor against homophobic name-calling or bullying. Hegemonic masculinity in schools is one of the greatest challenges to tackling homophobic name-calling. So interventions might focus on promoting more diverse forms of masculinity or decreasing the effect of the in-group mentality of hegemonically masculine peer groups, perhaps by increasing contact and knowledge of other forms of masculinity, and this might be through role models. This review also highlights the important role of empathy in this relationship, and therefore empathy may be a protective factor and an area to focus on for intervention and for future research. So that was the first paper in my thesis. If you want to know more, you can watch my other presentation about the empirical paper. If you have any questions, you can reach me at this email address. Otherwise, thanks for listening.